Hello, Paperback Warrior fans. This is Tom. I'm actually driving in my car right now. I'm recording this on Friday the 26th, and Eric just sent me a text message telling me that Larry Mcmurtry just died at age 84. And I guess I just want to offer my condolences to the Mcmurtry family, not that they're listening, and to just the fans of Larry Mcmurtry. He, of course, is the author of Lonesome Dove, which was one of my favorite books ever. I read it in my 20s. It's about a cattle drive that occurs with two old Texas Rangers and has a lot of really colorful characters. And it's a bit divisive in the Western community because it's really more of a work of literary fiction that masquerading as a Western. But man, oh man, is it a great page turner. So I'm sad to hear Larry Mcmurtry died. He was a big deal, and he was a big deal to me. And hope you guys take the time to read his books and just take a moment to remember him. Now on to the tomfoolery and hijinks of the Paperback Warrior podcast.
So, Eric, did you hear about that kidnapping at that high school down the street?
No.
Yeah, the teacher saw this kid napping in class and woke him up. It's the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the 84th episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm here with my co-host Tom, and every week we discuss old paperbacks from the 20th century from a reader's perspective. We've got a blog at paperbackwarrior.com where Tom and I review old books in the adventure, crime, spy, horror, science fiction, and western genres, as well as any other old paperbacks that really draw us in. Let me throw it over to Tom to talk about this episode. Tom, are you over there?
I am here. Thanks, Eric. Today's feature is going to be about the life and work of an author named Robert Terrall, who wrote the Ben Gates series under the name Robert Kyle, as well as dozens of Mike Shane novels under the name Brett Halliday. Now, for my review today, I'm going to tell you about this crazy 1954 paperback by Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. The book's called The Kidnapper, and it's really something special, so I'm looking forward to telling you about that. What is your review today, Eric?
Today I'm going to be reviewing The Violent Ones by a guy named Howard Hunt.
All right. Oh, the Howard Hunt.
The Howard Hunt.
The E. Howard Hunt.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so before we get into the feature, I got some odds and ends I want to cover. Eric, I am concerned about you, buddy. We need to have a heart-to-heart talk.
Okay. All right, I'm going to play along with this. What's concerning you?
I am worried that you are not getting enough vintage nursing fiction in your diet.
Did you say... What are you saying? Nursing?
Nursing, as in a nurse.
Nursing fiction.
Exactly. So, yes.
Okay.
What do you think?
I can't say I've ever heard of this.
Okay, so I'm going to drop some knowledge bombs on you today about the glories of nursing fiction.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so the first nursing book series that I know of was the Cherry Ames series, which spanned 27 books from the 1940s to the 1960s. Cherry began the series as a student nurse and worked her way up to a senior registered nurse while solving mysteries along the way. Now, the author was a woman named Helen Wells from Danville, Illinois, who lived from 1910 to 1986. Now, the target market for the Cherry Ames books were teenage girls, and they served an important societal function, inspiring many young women to go into the nursing profession at a time when America was suffering a real nursing shortage. The original Cherry Ames books are collector's items, and the series was so popular that it launched a media tie-in board game from Parker Brothers.
How about that?
My impression is that the books were very much in the mold of like Nancy Drew. Now, for a more adult version of nursing noir, may I recommend, I'm going to hand this to you, the books of Harriet Katherine Myers. Take a look at this paperback I just handed you, and tell the listeners what you're looking at.
Prodigal Nurse, by Harriet Katherine Myers. It says, she had healed others, why not herself?
There you go. It's an ace paperback by Harriet Katherine Myers. Looks like the copyright is 1963. Does that look about right to you?
Yes.
Okay. In this book, a nurse named Judy Austin is working at Greystone Memorial Hospital, and she's being courted by a doctor. Now, something bad happens, Eric. I'm not going to give it away. And the doctor who courted her so boldly is now accusing her of negligence and the death of a patient, Eric. Are you with me?
The horror.
The book deals with Judy's heroic fight to protect her reputation as a nurse when the truth might ruin her last chance for happiness with this hunky doctor. Because nurses of 1963 could only self-actualize by marrying a doctor. Okay. There's another Harriet Catherine Myers book. I'm going to flip this around to you so you can take a look at it. Here we are.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, it's called Small Town Nurse. It's from 1962. Now, I read a review of this one in a blog that I like called Mostly Old Books and Rust by a friend of the show, Ed McBride. If anyone likes what we do at Paperback Warrior, they would also like Ed's blog. So the Small Town Nurse is about a nurse named Anne Wellington who's working in a small beach community. She falls for this young doctor named Bruce Grayson, and there's a murder and a trial and a twist ending. There's nothing not to like about Small Town Nurse. Now, Eric, I'm going to confess something to you. I'm hiding the ball here from you. Because Harriet Catherine Myers is none other than a pseudonym from Florida's king of paperbacks, Harry Whittington.
How about that?
Isn't that something?
I had no idea.
He wrote several books in this nursing genre, including one in his own name called The Young Nurses that explored fear, love, and twisted passions in an explosive story of a big city hospital. That one was from 1961. For those of you looking for something a little more dangerous and sexy, I have an ebook from 1962. It was a Midwood paperback called Intimate Nurse. I'm going to turn this around for you. Take a look at Intimate Nurse.
I like the cover.
Yes, very nice. By Kimberly Kemp. It's about a live-in nurse who brings trouble to an unsuspecting family when she begins seducing the female members of the family and turning them all into lesbians.
Wow.
Because that's how it works, Eric.
That's bold.
All you need is a nurse to seduce you once, and next thing you know, bam, you're a lesbian.
Yeah.
The author Kimberly Kemp is a pseudonym for a guy named Gilbert Fox.
Okay.
And who wrote a lot of lesbian pulp fiction in the early 1960s.
So are you going to read, are you going to read and review these things or what?
I'd like to read Prodigal Nurse by Harry Whittington, writing as Harriet Catherine Myers. Mostly because I'm a huge Harry Whittington fan. And I bet you the book's actually excellent because everything he touches is pretty excellent. However, you can choose whether or not you want to run this review on Paperback Warrior since you're the boss here.
Well, I was going to ask real fast. Didn't you review The Young Nurses last year?
I did not.
Okay, I thought you did a nurse book that Harry Whittington wrote, or a doctor book or something.
You might have been looking at Ed McBride's blog instead of your own.
Maybe so. I could have swore you did that. I mean, I feel like we've kind of just kicked the doors open completely, aren't we? I mean, we were reviewing everything, it seems like.
Well, yeah, and much to the chagrin of many of our readers. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, yeah, right.
But we can do anything we want, right?
Yeah, and it's funny because you're showing me these nurses books, or these nursing books, and I'm sending you photos of all these gothic romances that I've been buying.
I know, we're getting very feminized, aren't we?
What is going on?
I know. I think we need testosterone supplements.
Anyway.
Let me shift gears a little bit. Starkhouse has released a book that I didn't believe existed until I actually got it in my hands. I'm going to hand this to you. Take a look at this book. It's a reference book called The Manhunt Companion by Peter Infantino and Jeff Vorzimmer. As you can see, it's about 400 pages long. It begins with a preface, whatever, and then a long introduction by Vorzimmer on the history of Manhunt magazine. We've talked about it a lot on the show. Very influential magazine. The rest of the book, and I cannot believe they actually did this, goes through, dig this, every issue of Manhunt from 1953 to 1967 with a capsule summary and review of every single story ever appearing in the magazine. Let that sink in for a minute, Eric, and just consider the scope of this undertaking that these two maniacs did.
Yeah, I'm flipping through here, and this is unbelievable. It's literally got little capsule reviews of every single story.
Starred, right? Like there's a one-star story, there's a five-star story.
And it's all laid out under volume number and then month and year, and there's even little black and white covers of the magazines themselves.
Imagine the work that went into publishing, creating this.
I can't imagine how much work this is.
So all the reviews, and I went through it, all the reviews in this guide for each story are spoiler-free, so they're not ruining any stories for you. And they rate every story. It's actually 1 to 4 stars. I think the temptation for the editors would be to be overly enthusiastic, But if anything, I think they were a little grouchy in their assessments. They gave a lot of the stories like 1 and 2 stars. The book has several helpful indices in the back, listing every story by issue, story title, author, series, as well as a list of TV episodes based on stories that appeared in Manhunt. Now, at first I thought this was interesting, but who the heck is going to buy and use and read this book? I mean, there's maybe a dozen people in America who care this much about Manhunt. And then I received an offer on Facebook from a guy who was willing to sell me a copy of Manhunt from February 1959 for $20. I ended up buying the copy, and here it is. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. In fact, it's like in a comic book bag. Go ahead and unbag it if you want. So what I could do then is I could actually look up the February 1959 issue of Manhunt in this companion and look at the contents. Now, the issue is anchored by a full-length novel by Ed McBain as part of his 87th Precinct series. The novel's called Killer's Wedge. And the guys in the review, in the book you have in your hand there, they gave that novel 4 stars, and they provide a very nice description of it. There's also a pretty long novella in this issue by Joe Griesenbach called Second Chance that gets 3.5 stars. And there's a story by Paul Johnson called Killer in the Ring that gets 2.5 stars, and so on. So before I pulled the trigger on this issue of Manhunt that I bought for $20, I have an amazing resource to find out, is this issue any good? Is it more than just a pretty cover? Now, McBain ended up beefing up Killer's Wedge and releasing it as a standalone 87th Precinct paperback. So this issue of Manhunt wasn't like essential for me to own. But man, as you know, Manhunt magazines are so hard to find. So I got it just because I'm like the girl who can't say no. And so that's one use for the Manhunt companion.
Yeah, when you handed me this this Manhunt, which is bagged, I immediately turned this book to the February 1959 issue. I mean, it was easy to find.
Yeah.
And you've got all the stories listed. You've also got the words, the amount of words. So you know that...
Whether it's a shorter... How long the story is,
Like Killer's Wedge is 27,000 words compared to Lovers by R.J. Hodgkins, which is 2,000 words.
Right. So did these maniacs go in there and like count the words, or they just sort of estimate? I mean, they must estimate.
They probably used a software program.
Okay.
But let me ask you, the ones that you think that are 3 and 4 stars in here, do you think that these stories were culled to the Manhunt compilations, the volumes 1 and 2?
I have not reconciled that. I mean...
Probably.
There's a magazine that went on for like a decade, and so my guess is they had 25 stories per issue. So looking at the companion, it has sunk into me how much leftover excellent content there is in Manhunt that has yet to be compiled in one of their compilations. Right. And I think these are selling very well for Starkhouse. So I hope Starkhouse steps it up and continues to release Manhunt compilations until they sort of shoot their wad with all the good stuff.
Yeah.
There's another use in this book that I'm kind of excited about. The starred reviews actually make for an easy visual cue. So I flip through the book, and then I see a 4-star review for a 21,000-word novella called 1 Hour Late by William O'Farrell. Now, I got a bunch of William O'Farrell books. I haven't read any of them. I've always wanted to read something by him. I don't know where to start. Now, I don't have the money or interest to find that April 1959 issue of Manhunt where that story appeared, but what I do have, Eric, is Google. So I Google 1 Hour Late by William O'Farrell, and I see that it was recently reprinted by Armchair Fiction. 2 clicks later on Amazon, I have a shiny reprint of this 4-star story from Manhunt in my hands. Look at that. I just handed it over to you.
Yeah, sorry. I get overwhelmed by just looking at the covers. So, yeah, 1 Hour Late's on one side, and then the other is Dangerous Lady by Octavius Roy Cohen.
Yeah. So now that I have this in paperback, I haven't had to buy a copy of Manhunt to have it. I have a shiny new reprint of it from Armchair Fiction, and I can read how, quote, being jailbait was sometimes a dangerous game. The other side, as you said, is Dangerous Lady by Octavius Roy Cohen, which I'm also happy to own. The upshot, man, is that this Manhunt companion from Starkhouse is essential for anyone who's a fan of Manhunt magazine or just a fan of hard-boiled crime stories and novellas. I have no idea who's going to buy this thing, but I know I'm going to use it like crazy to seek out the stories from the magazines, which probably now many exist as reprints or have been put into compilations.
Is this out yet?
Yeah, it comes out like this month.
Okay.
I mean, we're recording this episode for the end of March. It's a March release, so it's either out by the time the listeners hearing this, it's definitely out, or it's 1 or 2 days away from being out.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So, anything from you, or can I launch right into the feature?
Yeah, let's get on with the feature.
All right, let's do it. Our feature today is on an author named Robert Terrall, who is best known for his work using 3 different pseudonyms. Under the name Robert Kyle, he wrote books in the Ben Gates series of hard-boiled detective stories. In one of those books, Kill Now, Pay Later, it was reprinted in paperback by Hard Case Crime under Mr. Terrall's own name. He wrote about 20, maybe more, Mike Shane novels under the house name of Brett Halliday between 1959 and 1986. Then he also wrote this little-known series starring a magazine investigative journalist named Harry Horne, that's Horne, written under the pseudonym of John Gonzalez. And he also wrote a slew of highly regarded standalone paperbacks and short stories back in the day. Listener, you should know about this guy because he's really good, and he writes in a very unique voice. I should say at the outset of this feature that my main source is an article about Mr. Terrall by J. Kingston Pierce on his website, The Rap Sheet. The article was called Rediscovering a Genre Star. Now, in the article, Pierce tracks down Mr. Terrall's son and interviews him about his dad's career. Now, Eric, you and I do that same thing quite often at Paperback Warrior. And I would say that Pierce is biting our style. Unfortunately, he wrote that article in 2009, way before your hair turned gray.
Right.
It's one of those articles that was frustrating for me to read because I wish I had written it myself. Anyway, that's my source for this feature, and I'm going to try not to make this just a dramatic reading of the Rap Sheets article. But that would be a challenge because it's actually a perfect work of vintage paperback investigative journalism that he did. So hats off to him. Anyway, so let's go back in time. Robert Terrall, born 1914 in Montana. His family relocated to Oregon and settled in Cleveland, Ohio for his teenage years. Now, he must have been a smart cookie because he went to Harvard and graduated with honors in 1936 with a degree in English. Now, at Harvard, he wrote for the legendary comedy publication called the Harvard Lampoon. The publication still exists today, and it produces some of the smartest comedy writers in Hollywood. If you watch the credits of Saturday Night Live, The Simpsons, or any really smart comedy show for the past 50 years, and Google the writing staff, most of them went to Harvard, and they all wrote for the Harvard Lampoon. Now, when you read Terrall's crime fiction writing, he's got a real knack for clever dialogue and one-liners, but way smarter and more sophisticated than the wisecracking private eyes that other authors in that era were delivering. After graduating college, he gets a job as a movie critic for Time magazine. I suspect that this brief stint at Time magazine served as the basis of his character, Harry Horne, who was an investigative journalist for a weekly news and culture magazine. Because he was a Harvard Lampoon man, Time wanted him to write humor articles for them, but the editor didn't think that Terrall's brand of humor fit Time's style, so they fired him. Now, the Harvard Lampoon was always known for edgy, kind of dangerous comedy, and I can imagine that Time magazine wanted something a little more stuffy and mainstream. Like most educated, creative types, he dabbled in communism in the 1930s and 1940s, and he wrote some articles for workers' publications. After Time magazine fired him, though, he finds a job in the shipyards of New York. Then he gets drafted into World War II. And he served with General George S. Patton's 65th Infantry Division during the invasion of Europe and with the Allied occupying army in Austria. He returns back to the U.S. from the war, and he goes back to being a writer. He starts selling stories to the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's. He sold his first novel in 1943 called They Deal in Death. It was an espionage novel involving Nazi diamond smugglers. He wrote a couple other so-called serious literary novels in his own name from this era that really kind of went nowhere financially, and they took way too long for him to write, which obviously is a detriment to making money. Meanwhile, the market for magazine short stories was also drying up around this time. So we hear the story every week, Eric. 1950s roll around. What happens? Paperback original genre fiction, right?
Yep.
It's the hot new thing. So he does what a lot of talented guys from that era did. He starts writing mystery novels for the paperback houses. At the time, he was a really big fan, like you and I, of the work of Charles Williams. And Terrall correctly identified Charles Williams as being an excellent writer.
Very astute.
So he begins to silo his writing into different pseudonyms, and he does this for continuity purposes. I think the best way to address his body of work as we go through his books and make recommendations is to talk about his 3 series titles, and we'll recommend one book from each to our listeners for sampling purposes. So let me start with the Ben Gates series, written as Robert Kyle. The series ran for 5 installments, starting in 1958 with Blackmail Inc., Blackmail Incorporated. And it ended in 1964 with Ben Gates is Hot.
That's an odd title.
It is a weird title. I think it was probably a very different meaning in 1964. Each of the books stand alone quite nicely, and they can be read in any order. Now, Gates as a PI is a very funny, charming, sexually active private eye. He's got a secretary who refuses to do any typing, and a hypochondriac Jewish buddy who's built like a tank, both of whom are like recurring characters, like sidekicks for him. The books were published by Dell, and Dell always played up, I guess, the sexual content of it. And I have to say, Terrall could write incredibly sexy scenes without ever being graphic. Now, his plotting tends to be a little complicated, for my taste at least, and that was a recurring problem with his books. He recognized this failing himself, and he had a sign up in his writing room of his house that simply said, "Simplify."
I like that.
It is nice. We could all use that as advice. The highest regarded of the Ben Gates book is now the easiest to find. It's called Kill Now, Pay Later, and it was reprinted under Terrall's own name by Hard Case Crime and remains in print today. Interestingly, the 1960 paperback, the original one, and the 2007 reprint both have original cover art from the great Robert McGinnis, and they're both 2 of the sexiest covers I've ever seen in my life. Now, Eric, we both read Kill Now, Pay Later, but you reviewed it for Paperback Warrior. If you can briefly give the listener your review.
Yeah, so Ben Gates, as you mentioned, he's a New York City private eye, and at the beginning of the book we find that he's working a ritzy wedding for an insurance company. And the job's pretty simple. All he has to do is just guard the wedding presents and keep all the tipsy guests from making off with the family jewels. After Gates is teased by this sultry female guest, he mistakenly drinks a handful of sleeping pills that's kind of hidden in a mug of coffee. And Gates falls asleep while the groom's mother is shot and killed in a robbery attempt. The thief is also killed, but there's more to the story. The police think Gates was in on the grab, and the officer seems to have a personal vendetta, I guess against private eyes in general, which isn't uncommon in crime fiction. A newspaper article was published about the murder and points out that Gates was asleep through the whole debacle. And now Gates wants to redeem himself and discover who was actually serving him this loaded coffee. Also, the wealthy groom's father also hires Gates to solve the theft and murder. I really, really loved this Ben Gates character. He's kind of like the middle ground between, let's say, serious Lou Archer and comedic Shel Scott. The author's witty dialogue and candor enhance the story and the character, making them both instantly enjoyable. Gates doesn't necessarily chase women, but he isn't one to turn away from a hot undercover romp. And in Kill Now, Pay Later, there's a number of sexy women attempting to lure Gates into bed, or, in a way, just kind of remove him from the investigation. If you love urban detective novels, there's plenty to enjoy. Kill Now, Pay Later is just another solid private eye novel that stands out in a crowded field of a lot of mid-20th century crime fiction. Ben Gates' charisma is leveraged by the author to really define the storytelling experience. Based on the high level of quality here, I'll be searching for the remaining series installments for sure.
Okay, good. And that book, again, is Kill Now, Pay Later. You can find the old paperback under the name Robert Kyle. You can find the new reprint under the name Robert Terrall. And thanks, Eric. Now, during the same time that he was writing the Ben Gates series for Dell, Terrall was also writing the Harry Horn series for Fawcett Gold Medal under the name John Gonzalez. Now, why he chose a Hispanic name is anybody's guess, but the writing is clearly in Terrall's funny and very smart style. The Harry Horn series only lasted for 3 books. First one was Death of a JD being juvenile delinquent. Second was Someone is Sleeping in My Bed in 1962. And the third was Follow That Hearse from 1963. Now, in the Rap Sheet article, Mr. Pierce says that the series went on for 5 installments, but that doesn't appear to be accurate, because I think Pierce is counting 2 standalone novels that Terrall wrote under the Gonzalez name. Anyway, the good news is that Death of a JD is still in print as a $1 ebook. The downside is that the book's publisher changed the name to Out of the Frying Pan into the Funeral.
How awful.
Stupid title. And they slapped a terrible photo cover on it. You can find it on Amazon under the John Gonzalez name. I checked, and it's the exact same text from the 1960 Fawcett Gold Medal edition, Death of a JD, which is the first book in the series. I recently finished the novel, and it's excellent. It was also Robert Terrall's favorite of his 3 series that he wrote. Harry Horn is a swinging single magazine reporter in New York. He returns home from a date and finds a strange woman taking a shower in his apartment. Not a bad problem to have. She's naked because this is a Robert Terrall book and because that's how people took showers back in 1960.
Right.
Anyway, as soon as he gets her out of the shower and gets her dressed, she tries to kill him. He doesn't know this babe at all, and he winds up with a knife in his belly, an injury that ends up landing him in the hospital. So the first mystery to solve is, who is this girl and why is she trying to kill Harry? The title, Death of a JD, kind of gives away the plot point that this whole thing has something to do with an article Harry wrote after embedding himself with a juvenile delinquent street gang called the Sorcerers. I like this book a lot. It was way better written than it had to be, and it's definitely worth getting your hands on. Again, the title is called Death of a JD by John Gonzalez, or you can grab the ebook Out of the Frying Pan into the Funeral on your Kindle, also by John Gonzalez. Now, the third series we need to cover is his Mike Shane series, written under the name Brett Halliday. Now, of course, as we've discussed on the show before, the series actually started in 1939, with Davis Dresser being the primary author for the first 20 years. By 1959, Dresser was burned out, and the publisher hired Terrall to become Brett Halliday, starting with a book called Target Mike Shane. Even to this day, it's unclear exactly how many Mike Shane books were written by Terrall, but we are sure about 20. Dell, the publisher, had other ghostwriters, including Dennis Lyons, working on the series at the same time. Now, Terrall got the job because he had been writing his Robert Kyle books for Dell, including the first Ben Gates book, Blackmail Inc., as well as a standalone heist novel called The Golden Urge. You ever seen this?
Yeah, I have 2 copies of this thing.
Yeah, I do too. 2 copies, 2 different covers.
Yeah.
So Dell was familiar with his style, and the publisher thought that he wrote in a similar way to Davis Dresser and chose him to continue the Mike Shane series. Here's a fun thing. A printing of the 1962 Ben Gates book by Robert Kyle, Some Like It Cool, let me hand this to you, has a cover blurb that read, "If I ever get a case where I need help, I'll call on Ben Gates. First of all, the guy is terrific." Now, the blurb is from, do you see it there? Brett Halliday, author of the Mike Shane series. Today we know that Terrall was both Kyle and Halliday at the same time. So even though about half the books were Mike Shane novels, Terrall had no affection at all for the series. He thought that Davis Dresser was a terrible author, and he shared my opinion that the Shane character was incredibly dull. So when Terrall started writing the Shane books, he began infusing the character with an actual personality, with some wit and style. As time went on, cultural norms changed, and he also started adding more sexy content to the Mike Shane books. Now, I read and reviewed a Mike Shane book called Death of a Hitchhiker from 1974. I've discussed it on the show before, and I won't go on too long. The gist is that a maniac kidnaps a girl and straps her to a gynecologist examination table with her feet belted into stirrups. The kidnapper explains that he's a medical student seeking to use this girl in his own research involving human sexuality. Specifically, he wants to unlock the female orgasm with an unwilling recipient. So as you get to see, things changed quite a bit from the 1940 version of Mike Shane mysteries. Despite making the plot a little too convoluted, which again was his problem, it was a pretty fun mystery adventure novel with Shane trying to save the girl. Again, the title of that one's Death of a Hitchhiker. It's the 65th Mike Shane book, and it has not been reprinted, so you got to find the original one with the weird photo cover. His last book was in 1980 or so, and then he retired from writing for the last 29 years of his life. He lived in a retirement community in Connecticut until age 94, when he died from Lyme disease in 2009. The best guess is that he wrote 54 novels in his career.
How about that?
Anyway, that's about it for Robert Terrall. He's definitely worth checking out, and I want to thank the Rap Sheet again for giving me all the information in this for the article and from their article, and also the Thrilling Detective website was pretty helpful too. So let's move on. Eric, you got a review to do. Why don't you jump in and talk?
Yeah, so last July, we did a feature right here on the show about CIA operative and Watergate burglar Howard Hunt. He's got a really incredible life story, and all that's captured back on episode 52. And both Tom and I have been sprinkling in Howard Hunt's novels in our reviews here on the show and also on the blog. Today I'm going to talk about his 1950 novel, The Violent Ones. There's 3 reasons for this. First, I like Howard Hunt's work. Second, The Violent Ones has been reprinted by Cutting Edge in physical and ebook editions. Third, The Violent Ones has also been reprinted by our good friends at Armchair Fiction. So the book's got to be great to warrant so much attention to it, right?
Yeah, today, I mean, it's amazing that this book's getting so much shine this many years after its original publication.
Well, the novel stars Cameron, a rugged World War II veteran, and he walks in on his wife and her lover doing the nasty years ago. And he ends up beating his wife's boyfriend to a pulp. And Cameron goes to prison, and this guy ends up being paralyzed for the rest of his life. In the book's opening pages, we find that Cameron has been released from prison, and he's on a plane traveling to France to reunite with his old war buddy Thorne for a potential heist. It's explained that during the war, the Allies dropped arms and gold to the Macassards, which are, I had to look this up, but they're a fierce underground band of French resistance fighters. After the war was over and the Germans were long gone, no one bothered to locate the whereabouts of these guns and all these riches. In 1945, the gold is cached by certain parties and left undetected. Now, 5 years later, Thorne finds himself in debt to a local gambling house, and he's forced to make a daring venture to clear up his account. Teaming with Cameron, the duo aim to move the gold to Switzerland undetected by authorities. After one night in the city, Cameron finds Thorne murdered. So the question is, who killed him, and who else is after who else is after this gold? The upside is that Cameron is a really great character, and I loved his backstory with the cheating wife and his 2 love interests that are in this novel. Both were just so sexy, and Hunt expertly describes the encounters. The main problem, and there's a lot, is that Cameron isn't a formidable hero at all. He's routinely assaulted by the enemy, and he's left to mend his wounds for just another chance at him. He's just so average in terms of respectability, but man, he's got the makings of being this really tough guy. I mean, he's a war veteran, he paralyzed his wife's lover, he's a chick magnet. I couldn't grasp the dense, overly contrived plot here. Even Cameron seems confused with what's happening with the gold. He just summarized the confusion with a lackadaisical, I guess that makes sense, statement. It was just so bizarre.
I think the writer just sort of gave up.
I think so. My largest complaint, though, is that Hunt uses this book as a way to boast of his knowledge of all these French locales and cuisine. I mean, whole sections of this book are in French. We're talking about names, dialogue, food,
I hate it when authors do that.
I found myself missing, parts of the story because of the language barrier. And I know Hunt was a legit spy, and his expertise in, all these European affairs with the likes of Russian commissars and the FTP, whatever the hell that is, and the Macassars is impressive. But I wanted this really slicked-up action-adventure novel with treasure seekers and, paid assassins and beautiful women. But Hunt fails to produce any kind of compelling story among all these, I guess unnecessary details. Nevertheless, I'm happy I read the book, and I still have a ton of respect for Hunt's writing and all the numerous novels that he produced. However, they aren't all gems, and I think that The Violent Ones proves that. But it's worth reading. I think it's definitely worth reading if you like European spy novels, and those aren't typically my forte, as you know.
Right.
I don't do well with those.
Yeah.
My review of the Hart Muldoon is it Hart Muldoon series?
Yeah.
It didn't do any justice by me reviewing it, but maybe you'll like it.
Who knows? All right, say the title and author one more time.
The Violent Ones by Howard Hunt, or
Okay.
E. Howard Hunt.
E. Howard Hunt
Yeah.
to you, pal. So for my review today, I'm going to tell you about a 1954 book called The Kidnapper by Robert Bloch. You know him as the author of Psycho. Because of the association with his mentor H.P. Lovecraft and the success of the movie Psycho, Robert Bloch is remembered as a horror writer. But he also did a lot of work in crime fiction. In fact, I would actually maintain that Psycho is more of a suspenseful crime fiction story than a horror novel anyway, but we'll leave that aside. That's a different argument for a different day. So Bloch's novel, The Kidnapper, was released by an upstart crime fiction paperback house called Lion Books in 1954, so it was 5 years before Psycho came out. Now, it's been reprinted by Tor Books in 1988 with more of a horror-themed cover and a modernization of the spelling of the word kidnapper. In 1988, kidnapper was spelled with 2 P's, but a couple decades before that, when Bloch wrote the book, it only had 1 P. And Robert Bloch cites this book as among his best work. So the narrator is a guy named Steve Collins. He's a freight train riding drifter and a petty criminal, and he breezes into town and lands a job working the night shift at a factory. Now, Steve is not a very nice guy, and so you need to be comfortable if you read this book spending about 180 pages with this cold, calculating anti-hero operating with a severely busted moral compass. So then we cut to Shirley May. She's a 4-year-old daughter of a wealthy businessman in town. Now, Steve's new girlfriend is Shirley May's nanny, and he sees a real opportunity to make some big cash in a kidnapping and ransom gambit. He enlists the help of his dim-witted friend in the execution of the scheme, and the scheme to kidnap this kid goes very, very wrong. And the majority of the novel is Steve's attempt to salvage the operation, get the money, and get lost. Eric, this is a sincerely dark noir novel. And it was clearly inspired by Jim Thompson, who was basically doing the same thing at the same time. It's also an excellent book if you're looking something for a book that's just really gritty as hell to read. The Steve character he's an unapologetic sociopath, but very logical and level-headed, so the book doesn't kind of force you into a mentally ill mind in the narration as many of Thompson's paperbacks do. Bloch does a fantastic job keeping the action moving, and the tension-filled pages just really fly by. So as long as you know what you're getting into and you're comfortable with dark and untidy crimes in your crime fiction, The Kidnapper by Robert Bloch is a very easy recommendation. Eric, why don't you go ahead and spike the ball and wrap this one up?
All right, this concludes episode number 84 of the Paperback Warrior podcast. You can read our book reviews every day at paperbackwarrior.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter to join the conversation. Drop comments on our YouTube page. And also email us at paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com. We'll be back next Monday with another shockingly good episode. So on behalf of Tom, this is Eric signing off.
Be cool.